You're an Outside the Belly. I'm John Fredericks, and I'm your blowtorch for free speech in America. Hey, thanks for being with us today. Todd Sheets coming up. I keep saying that. We don't have him on. Sorry, Todd. You are coming up right now. The math is simple. Every dollar that we waste on unnecessary federal supervision is a dollar we can't use to fight violent crime. Now, the Safer Supervision Act cuts bureaucratic waste and frees up law enforcement resources to protect families from serious threats. Law enforcement officers across the nation, like you've seen in Minnesota, and Republicans in Congress agree, this is a smarter way to improve public safety. Stop the waste, protect our communities, fix federal supervision. Visit safersupervision.com for help. That's safersupervision.com for help. This has been paid for by the Reform Action Fund, and you are good to go. Okay, finally, we get to Todd Sheets. Todd, thanks for your patience.
Great to be with you again.
So, Todd, Jerome Powell whining, complaining. Look, he went to Congress. He said the cost was going to be X. It's, X squared plus Y cubed. And so, you're supposed to give a cost estimate that's real. He didn't do that. But this guy is under fire. Here's what I want you to comment on. The hypocrisy of this guy is beyond the pale. He lowered interest rates for Biden-Harris when inflation was raging at 15%. Defies all economic logic. Now he doesn't want to do it for Trump going into these midterms, but he did it for Biden in 24 where it didn't make any sense. Comment on that.
Yeah, well, look, I'm no fan of Jerome Powell. I agree. Look, they waited way too long to raise interest rates when inflation ran crazy during the early part of the Biden administration. And then when they started lowering them, going into the presidential election, year before last, it was too much too soon. So I think you're right on. They clearly made mistakes there. I'm not a fan of the Fed in general. As we've talked about before, my response to all of this would be get rid of the Fed, get them out of the game of setting interest rates and let markets set interest rates so that we don't have any of this kind of stuff going on. So, that's where I'm at with all those kinds of things. I think who knows what's going on with Powell and, these criminal charges and that kind of thing. Certainly some on Wall Street, apparently Scott Bessent may have felt like this was a little bit of overkill. I'm probably leaning on that side of the argument, but coming from the perspective of clearly not being a fan or a supporter of either the head of the Fed or the Fed itself.
Look, at the end of the day, we got to get mortgage rates down so young people can afford to buy a home. Now, they went down to 6%. I ran that tape earlier. Part of this was President Trump's initiative to sell these mortgage bonds. What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, so here again, you might not like my response. The key to getting mortgage rates down consistently and sustainably is to get inflation down. Longer term bonds, mortgages, whatever the fixed income instrument is, they trade at a spread over inflation because who's ever lending their money has to be compensated for the risk of default and the risk that inflation gets out of control and eats up, all of their return, all of their real return. So you look back at this stuff historically, there's always a spread between inflation and these longer term interest rates, starting with treasuries and then building up to safer things like mortgage bonds and less safe things like corporate bonds. And then you get to junk debt and that kind of thing. So the real critical issue here is bringing inflation down. And hopefully that will happen, with productivity gains. And we're starting to see some signs of that. It hasn't happened yet. We've seen inflation kind of holding steady. With respect to pushing the mortgage rates down, getting Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy back mortgage bonds, that may have some effect. I'm not a big fan because, again, I think these are the things that we did to get ourselves in this problem in the first place. Mm-hmm. We were pushing low more interest rates on the short end with the Fed. Mm-hmm. We had the Federal Reserve at that time buying huge quantities of bonds, of government bonds and mortgage bonds, agency bonds. And all of those things are what inflated the housing prices in the first place. So I don't think enough is going to be done here to probably swing the balance that significantly, but I'd be more in favor of continuing the focus they've had on growing the economy, get the jobs growing, and keep inflation down. And I think that's the really long-term solution to all this.
Yes, no question, inflation's got to come down and the supply of money has got to get restricted. However, Todd, as you know, if you can continue with 5.4% GDP growth, which we had allegedly, I guess, because the numbers change a bit, but it's certainly about 5.5% growth in Q4. I mean, when you get that kind of growth, then that's going to affect inflation, because inflation is driven, of course, by too much cash in the market chasing too few goods, etc. But when you get that kind of growth, according to Milton Friedman, things change. Explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And it's also, I mean, we want the jobs to grow. That will happen. These big GDP numbers that we're seeing are both incredibly important, and then in the short term, politically, we've got to be aware of the fact that jobs is the real key. But the importance of these big GDP prints in both the third quarter and apparently in the fourth quarter, I think it's the Atlanta Fed's projection that you're referring to there, which has a pretty high level of credibility.
Yeah,
that tells us that this anemic job growth that we're still seeing and have seen over the last several months is not an indicator of us slipping into a recession.
exactly.
That is the big thing, because
Exactly.
if you weren't seeing this kind of GDP growth, then you're sitting around worried that, hey, we could be dropping into a real recession, and then maybe we've got 12, 18, 24 months before we dig ourselves out of that hole. I think the most likely scenario is this economy is already moving at a very fast clip. Again, I think, as you know, I've been a supporter of the tariffs from the beginning, but I think we've got to get those buttoned down so businesses know their costs. I think one of the reasons we haven't seen tariffs turn into inflation, in addition to the fact that they're just not as inflationary as everybody thought, but one of the reasons is there's a lot of businesses out there that know they can't increase their prices that much in this environment. So they're holding back on job growth and that kind of thing. And they need to get some certainty and get this stuff buttoned down. I think with that and all the other things we have coming, it's highly likely we have a blowout year coming ahead of us. And eventually the jobs will come, hopefully sooner rather than later. And I think that's the most likely scenario here. So all of that is great news and should be good for inflation, as long as the Fed is not setting rates too low and then pushing the monetary policy so fast that it's running ahead of even what's happening with the economy and that kind of thing.
So basically, I think you're even going to see this accelerate when the big beautiful bill and that tax cut, people start actually realizing it by getting these refund checks back, or not paying as much as they thought they were going to have to pay, because this is real. So you're going to get that. I think the only thing that can derail this is another government shutdown, which is why I'm now for making whatever deal the Democrats want. I don't really care. Just don't, because a shutdown is going to just start this whole negative thing over again. The other thing about the jobs, even though we like them to be a little more robust, remember, almost 100% of the new jobs are private sector, native-born Americans. Two main things: not government like under Biden, private sector, and not illegals. They're native-born Americans. That's where you're getting the job growth. And I think that's what's going to turn into real growth here. Final thing, and then we got to go to a break. President Trump put a 10% limit on credit card interest 2026 starting in 8 days, 7 days. Reaction.
Well, I think this is a political move. I think this is, he's doing this to try and deal with this affordability issue. Long term, you can't cap these interest rates. If you try and cap prices, it doesn't work. You end up with a shortage of the goods that you're trying to set prices on. And in this case, I think longer term, we'd end up with a shortage of lending available to people who need to borrow, sometimes even at higher rates, that which then pushes them into markets, loan sharks and kind of things where,
Payday lending.
What's that?
Pushes them into payday lending, which they can charge you 50%.
Yeah, exactly. And you're in the gray market, you're in the black market for these kinds of things. So, I think one rule of thumb is anytime Elizabeth Warren is in favor of a policy, it's probably a pretty good sign that the best news about the policy, as I understand it, is that it's a 12-month deal and then it goes away.
Right.
So I'm generally not in favor of it. I think it's a political move, and I was glad to see that he had a 12-month limit on it.
Yeah, the cap is there. The cap is real. But the reason he did it, obviously, a lot of people got in debt, got the highest credit card debt ever. They're paying 28, 29, 30, 31% interest. He capped it. But the reality of that is going to curtail the availability of credit available, especially the people that don't have a 750, 800 credit rating, which is the majority of Americans. So, you got 1,500 or 2,000 limit, you want 3, you're going to get turned down unless you've got a 750 rating, which, there's not a lot of Americans that have that now. Todd, thank you. Stay with us. Elaine Parker next.